Hey friends, welcome back to another whiteboard value session. Now today I want to help you find more focus. Now this is a cool concept I learned from Tom Bilyeu. He posted an outline on how our focus is supposed to look like and what it looks like when it begins to get scattered. Because we all know how hard it is to stay focused nowadays with all of the distractions, the fast-paced world that we live in. So hopefully you can find some value on this. Now I want to get this right on the first try because I don't want to have to redo my pretty circle here. But with that said, this represents our focus. Now the way it's supposed to look is basically like this. Now, this arrow represents what many of us know as our selective focus, or you may have heard of it or referenced as the RAS, the reticular activating system. So our brain, our mind basically works like a missile. So if you give it a target, it will know where to go. But what begins to happen, as I mentioned, in today's fast-paced world with demands, responsibilities, and straight up distractions as well, our focus starts going like this. So we basically begin to open up different tabs, kind of like your computer. So what is it that happens when you open up too many tabs on your computer? It starts to slow down, it freezes up, it catches viruses, all kinds of crazy, wacky stuff. So imagine what your brain feels like when it's scattered like this. So that's where stress, overwhelm, anxiety, that's where all of this stuff comes from. And I've really tried to identify that personally in my life. So that's where I brought in a few of my extras that were not included in the outline that I saw. But as I mentioned, I always try to over deliver and bring you outstanding value. So what I try to implement in my productivity and in my focus is to remind myself of the Pareto principle. So many of us know it as the 80-20 rule. And that's basically focusing on the 20% of things, tasks, and activities that yield 80% of the results. Now, I will explain as I move along to the other practices how that begins to work. Now, the next one that I try to implement, once I remind myself, am I doing the 20% that's going to yield the result that I want? I try to begin to batch. Now, the perfect example is these videos or any type of content creation or maybe email marketing. You can begin to write or batch your content in advance. That way you can be a lot more organized, a lot more ahead of the game. And it sounds simple, right? But as I mentioned, when our focus goes in different directions, we lose track of this simple concept of batching. Now, with batching, you can also pretty much assign your different times throughout the day when you're going to focus on a particular task. So if it's content creation, a lot of the top creators will try and batch out 5 videos at a time. If you're doing editing or what have you, you try and focus on editing only. So batching different type of activities will really help you to find focus. Now, the next one is you also want to begin to delegate. Now, this one is super important. And like I said, it can relate to what I'm doing here with content creation. So at what point will you find benefit to outsourcing editing, or to outsourcing, as I mentioned, the email marketing? But the delegation part is also very important in everyday life, because we grow up, being responsible and so accustomed to doing everything ourselves. At least that's the way I was brought up. So as a single parent, I'm always trying to remind myself when I can and when I cannot do simple things like cut the grass, wash my car, or cook for my kids. That's where delegation comes in, because there's nothing wrong with paying somebody to do your yard work. There's nothing wrong with paying for dinner once in a while, when you just absolutely do not have time to prepare a meal, to cook, to meal prep, or what have you. And yes, there is a higher cost, but either way, you are either paying with time or with money. And as I mentioned, when you're paying with time, sometimes it can lead to the scattered focus of having too many things to do. And as I mentioned, that's where you begin to get overwhelmed. So think about where you can delegate things in your life. And as I mentioned, once you start doing this, that's where you begin to identify if you're focusing on the 20% that's going to yield the 80% of the results that you're looking for. Because as I mentioned, cutting the grass here is not going to yield a result for me building my brand, or getting more viewers, or whatever your personal task or personal goals are. So that's where delegation will remind you to reference the Pareto principle and remind yourself if you're focusing on the right things. And then ultimately, you want to begin to look at what you can eliminate. Is it a task or a practice that is really necessary to the ultimate lifestyle that you want to build? Because as I mentioned, we're accustomed to doing everything ourselves, but empires were not built by themselves. Good sustainable businesses were not built by themselves. And even people who begin to actually make progress ultimately build a team that begins to help them move forward. So as I mentioned, the way focus is supposed to look is exactly like this. Not with all the open tabs on your computer or what have you. It's supposed to be, like I said, like a missile. Our selective focus, or our RAS, is meant to keep us on track, but sometimes we're the ones that fall victim to multitasking, which is another thing that we're so accustomed to praise. But it's been my personal experience that the more things you have on your plate, the more overwhelmed that you feel. So there you have it, guys. That's my little breakdown on how you can begin to find more focus. And as I mentioned, if you like the video, feel free to share, like, or subscribe, and we'll see you on the next value session.